The saloon was thick with cigar smoke and the stink of cheap whiskey when her uncle traded her for a handful of silver dollars. They called her the mute girl, a broken thing. Nobody expected the hulking, bare-scarred trapper in the far corner to slam a heavy pouch of gold on the bar and claim her. And absolutely nobody expected what would happen months later when the silent bride finally opened her mouth to speak. Bitter Creek was less a town and more a festering wound on the side of the mountain. It was a place where desperate men clawed at the frozen earth for gold, and when they didn't find it, they drank until they forgot their blistered hands. The Mudhen Saloon sat at the center of it all. Its floorboards were permanently slick with spilled beer, spit, and the grey clay that coated every boot in the territory. Gideon sat in the darkest corner. He hadn't been down from the ridge in 4 months, and the noise of the saloon grated against his nerves like a dull saw. He nursed a glass of rye that tasted of rust and wood rot. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and weathered, wearing a heavy coat of cured elk hide. The left side of his face bore the brutal, jagged white map of a grizzly's claws, 3 deep grooves running from his temple down to a ruined jawline. Men tended to look at him once and quickly find somewhere else to stare. That suited Gideon just fine. He came to Bitter Creek for salt, flour, and coffee. He didn't come for company. Then the batwing doors slammed open. The biting winter wind blasted into the room, followed by the stumbling form of Hiram Reed. Hiram was a gambler who lost far more than he won, a sweaty, desperate little man with a rat-like face. But it wasn't Hiram that made the saloon go quiet. It was the woman he was dragging behind him by a length of frayed hemp rope tied around her wrists. Her name was Josephine. She was rail-thin, her dress a ragged collection of grey wool, her dark hair matted from the freezing rain. She didn't stumble. She didn't cry. She walked with a stiff, rigid spine, her boots hitting the floorboards with deliberate precision. Her eyes, pale and sharp as chipped flint, scanned the room. She looked like a trapped hawk waiting for the right moment to bite off its own leg to escape. $50. Hiram shouted, his voice cracking, as he hauled her toward the center of the room. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. I owe 50 to the house. I'm squaring my debt. She's a good worker, strong back, keeps to herself. The bartender, a thick-necked brute named Miller, crossed his arms. I run a saloon, Hiram, not a boarding house. What am I supposed to do with a half-starved girl? Put her to work. Hiram sneered, yanking the rope. Josephine stumbled, falling to her knees on the filthy floor. She didn't make a sound. She don't talk, hasn't said a word since she was 10, won't complain, won't backtalk the customers. A low murmur rippled through the miners crowding the bar. Desperate, lonely men. The kind of men who saw a silent woman not as a tragedy, but as a convenience. A miner with missing teeth and coal-dusted cheeks stepped forward, jingling coins in his pocket. I'll give you 30 for her, Hiram. She can scrub my floors. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Among other things. Gideon watched from the shadows. His hand tightened around his glass. The world was a cruel, ugly place. He had learned that a long time ago, carving out a life in the brutal cold of the high peaks. The mountain didn't care if you froze, it didn't care if you starved. But the mountain's cruelty was indifferent. The cruelty in this room was deliberate. It was a rotting sickness. Josephine lifted her head. Her gaze met the grinning miner, and there was no fear in her eyes, only a bottomless, venomous hatred. She shifted her weight quietly, bracing her boots against the floorboards. She was preparing to fight. She would lose, but she would fight. Gideon stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that cut through the murmurs. He stepped out of the shadows. The sheer size of him, coupled with the horrific ruin of his face, made the miners part like muddy water. He walked slowly toward the center of the room. The smell of pine resin, cold iron, and old blood rolled off him. He didn't look at the miners. He didn't look at Hiram. He looked at Josephine. She stared back. Her breathing was shallow, but she held his gaze. She didn't flinch at his scars. Gideon reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the nearest table. It landed with a dense, metallic thud that echoed in the quiet room. "There's 3 ounces of raw gold in there," Gideon said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, ruined by the cold and years of disuse. "Settle your debt, Hiram. The girl comes with me." Hiram blinked, staring at the pouch. The greedy miners stepped back. Nobody argued with a mountain man who paid in raw gold. Nobody argued with a man who looked like he had crawled out of a grave. Gideon didn't wait for a reply. He drew a heavy hunting knife from his belt. The steel flashed in the dim lamplight. Several men flinched, but Gideon merely knelt beside Josephine. With one quick, precise motion, he sliced the hemp rope binding her wrists. He stood, putting the knife away. He looked down at her. "Get up." Josephine rubbed her raw wrists. She looked at the door, then back at him. Slowly she climbed to her feet. She didn't smile. She didn't look grateful. She just watched him. "We have a long ride," Gideon said, turning his back on the silent saloon. "Keep close." He pushed through the batwing doors into the freezing mud of the street. After a second of hesitation, Josephine followed him into the storm. The trail up to the timberline was merciless. It was a winding, treacherous cut of loose shale and frozen mud that clung to the edge of the world. The wind whipped through the canyon, carrying biting flakes of early snow that stung the skin like crushed glass. Gideon rode a massive, sure-footed roan gelding. Josephine rode a sway-backed pack mule he had purchased an hour before leaving Bitter Creek. She sat stiffly in the saddle, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Gideon had tossed to her without a word. The cold was sinking into her bones, but she didn't shiver. She refused to show weakness. The silence between them was absolute. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the hollow clack of hooves against stone, the creak of freezing saddle leather, and the relentless howl of the wind. Gideon didn't look back to check on her. He didn't offer reassurances. He navigated the switchbacks with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had made this climb 1,000 times. Josephine watched the broad expanse of his back. She analyzed him. Men were predictable. They wanted obedience, they wanted labor, or they wanted a warm body in the dark. She had expected to be dragged to a dingy room behind the saloon. Instead, she was being led into the clouds. She touched the chafed skin of her wrists under the blanket. He had bought her. A transaction. He owned her now just as surely as he owned the gelding and the mule. But he hadn't touched her. He hadn't even looked at her with that heavy, wet gaze that Hiram and the miners had. He looked at her, the way he looked at the sky, assessing the weather, preparing for the work ahead. By nightfall, they reached a plateau sheltered by a massive stand of ancient twisted pines. Nestled against the rock wall was a cabin. It was sturdy, built of thick, notched logs, chinked with heavy mud and moss. The roof was pitched steep to shed the heavy mountain snows. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress against the elements. Gideon dismounted. He took the mule's reins and tied both animals to a heavy post under a lean-to. He unstrapped the canvas sacks of supplies. "Go inside," he grunted, nodding toward the heavy oak door. Josephine slid down from the mule. Her legs were numb, her knees buckling slightly as her boots hit the frozen dirt. She caught herself against the saddle, catching her breath. Gideon saw her stumble. He stopped his heavy boots crunching on the frost. For a second she braced herself, expecting a rough hand to grab her collar and drag her inside. Instead, he simply waited. When she found her footing, he turned and carried the supplies toward the door. Inside the cabin was freezing, smelling of cold ash and cured leather. It was a single room. A cast-iron stove sat in the center. In one corner, a heavy timber bed frame held a mattress stuffed with pine needles covered in thick bear and wolf pelts. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a wall lined with tools, traps, and dried herbs completed the space. It was impeccably clean. Gideon struck a match. He touched it to a pile of kindling in the stove. The fire caught quickly, casting dancing orange light across the room. The flickering shadows caught the deep, ruined scars on his face, making him look demonic in the dim light. Josephine stood awkwardly by the door. She didn't know where to stand. She didn't know what was expected of her. Gideon stood up and brushed the ash from his hands. He walked to a cupboard, pulled down a tin plate, and set it on the table. He tossed a chunk of hardtack and several thick strips of dried elk meat onto it. Then he pointed to one of the chairs. "Eat." She moved slowly. She sat down. She was starving her stomach, a hollow cavern of pain, but she didn't rush. She took a small piece of the elk meat and chewed it methodically. She watched him as she ate. Gideon took off his heavy coat, revealing a faded flannel shirt stretched tight across a muscular chest. He didn't sit at the table. He grabbed a whetstone and a hatchet from a shelf and sat on a heavy wooden crate near the fire. He began to sharpen the blade. The rhythmic shk of the stone against the steel filled the room. When she finished eating, she placed the tin plate gently on the table. She remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The fire was warming the room, thawing her frozen limbs, making her dangerously sleepy. But she didn't dare close her eyes. Gideon stopped sharpening the hatchet. He looked over at her. The silence stretched thick and heavy. "I didn't buy you to be a slave," Gideon said quietly. His voice didn't match his face. It was rough, but it held no malice. "I needed someone to watch the fire when I run the trap lines. Someone to keep the cabin from freezing over. You don't have to talk. I prefer the quiet anyway." He stood up, placed the hatchet on the mantel, and walked over to a heavy wooden chest. He pulled out a thick wool blanket. He tossed it onto the floor right in front of the warm stove. "You take the bed," Gideon said. He didn't wait to see her reaction. He lay down on the hard wooden floor, pulling the blanket over himself, his back turned to her. Josephine stared at him. She looked at the heavy timber bed piled high with thick, warm furs. She looked back at the massive man sleeping on the floor. For the first time in years, a tiny, unfamiliar crack formed in the armor around her heart. She walked to the bed, pulled off her boots, and slid beneath the heavy pelts. As the mountain wind screamed outside the thick log walls, Josephine closed her eyes, entirely safe in the dark. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a pale, bruised grey creeping through the single frosted window. Josephine woke to the harsh scrape of cast iron. She kept her eyes shut for a moment, listening. The heavy timber bed was warm, thick with the musky scent of bear fur and old wood. She didn't remember falling asleep. For years, sleep had only ever been a shallow, terrified doze. But here, suspended above the frozen earth, she had slept like the dead. She opened her eyes. Gideon was already up. He crouched by the stove, feeding split pine into the iron belly. The fire cracked and popped, throwing harsh orange light across his broad back. He wore the same heavy canvas trousers and a faded thermal shirt. His movements were economical. No wasted energy. Josephine sat up, pulling the heavy pelt to her chin. The air outside the bed was biting. Gideon didn't turn around, but the slight tilt of his head told her he heard the rustle of the furs. "Coffee's boiling," he said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the sound of the draft in the chimney. He stood, grabbed his heavy elk-hide coat from a peg by the door, and shrugged it on. He slung a rifle over his shoulder and picked up a canvas sack of iron traps. He walked to the door, resting his hand on the heavy iron latch. Finally, he looked back at her. The jagged white scars on his face looked starker in the morning gloom. "I run the upper ridge today. Won't be back till dusk." He pointed to a stack of chopped wood near the stove. "Keep the fire going. If you let it die, you'll freeze before I get back. Flour and beans are in the far barrel. Eat what you need." With that, he pulled the door open. A blast of sub-zero air rushed in swirling ash around the stove, and then he was gone. The heavy latch clicked shut. Josephine was entirely alone. She threw off the pelts and dressed quickly her breath, pluming in the cold cabin air, until she stood right beside the stove. She poured a measure of the dark, sludgy coffee into a tin cup and wrapped her raw, bruised hands around it. The heat seeped into her skin. She looked around the cabin. In the daylight it was austere but meticulously organized. Everything had a place. Traps hung on iron nails sorted by size. Dried herbs hung in neat, tied bundles from the rafters. The floors were swept clean. This was not the lair of a monster. It was the sanctuary of a survivor. She set her cup down. Hiram had sold her as a worker, and labor was the only currency she understood. She would earn her keep. She would make herself indispensable. It was the only way to ensure he wouldn't drag her back down the mountain and sell her to the miners when he grew tired of her. She found a wooden bucket and opened the door. The cold punched her in the chest. Snow stretched in every direction, a blinding, unbroken white under the heavy grey sky. She waded to the woodpile, loaded her arms with split logs, and carried them inside. She did this 4 times until the stack beside the stove was high and neat. Then she inspected the pantry. Dried beans, salt pork, a sack of flour, a tin of rendered bacon fat. She rolled up her sleeves. The hours bled away. The wind howled a constant mournful dirge against the thick log walls, but inside the cabin grew warm. Josephine found a basin melted snow and scrubbed the rough-hewn table until the wood was pale. She kneaded dough her knuckles, working the flour and water with a rhythmic, punishing force. She set a pot of beans and salt pork to simmer on the flat top of the stove. The smell of baking bread and rich, salty meat slowly filled the small room, masking the sharp tang of leather and wood smoke. By the time the window turned from grey to black, her back ached and her hands were raw again. She sat in the chair by the fire watching the door. An hour passed. Then 2. A quiet, familiar panic began to claw at her throat. If he died out there, she would die in here. She didn't know the trail back to Bitter Creek, and she would freeze long before she found it. Just as the panic threatened to swallow her, heavy boots crunched on the porch. The door pushed open. Gideon stepped inside, bringing a cloud of snow with him. His face was red from the wind, his beard crusted with ice. He dropped a canvas sack by the door. A thick smear of fresh blood stained the bottom of the canvas. He turned to secure the latch, freezing mid-motion. He smelled the air. He turned back, his dark eyes scanning the room. He saw the high stack of wood. He saw the scrubbed table. He saw the iron skillet holding a perfectly baked loaf of flatbread and the steaming pot of beans. Finally, he looked at Josephine. She stood by the stove, her posture rigid, waiting for a reprimand, waiting to be told she had wasted his supplies or overstepped her bounds. Gideon didn't speak. He took off his coat and hung it up. He unlaced his frozen boots and set them by the hearth. He walked to the cupboard, retrieved 2 tin plates, and brought them to the stove. He scooped generous portions of beans onto both and tore the bread in half. He set a plate on the table where she sat, then sat opposite her. He took a bite. He chewed slowly. The food was simple, but it was hot, and it was seasoned, and it wasn't hardtack. Gideon looked across the table at her. The harshness in his eyes had softened just a fraction. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice quiet. Josephine held his gaze. She picked up her own piece of bread, broke off a corner, and ate it. She didn't have to do it, but she had. Gideon nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "It's good," he murmured, looking back down at his plate. "Thank you." It was the first time in 10 years anyone had thanked her. Josephine kept her face entirely blank, but beneath the table her fingers curled tightly into her palms. The mountain was brutally cold, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely frozen. The blizzard hit 3 days later. It didn't announce itself with a gentle flurry. It slammed into the mountain like a physical blow. The wind shrieked a high-pitched, deafening roar that rattled the thick window pane and forced smoke back down the chimney. Gideon had left before dawn. By noon, the world outside was a churning wall of white. Josephine paced the small perimeter of the cabin. She stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed dull red, but the chill still seeped through the chinking. She tried to mend a tear in one of Gideon's spare shirts, but her hands were shaking. The needle slipped, pricking her thumb. She watched a drop of blood well up bright red against her pale skin. He shouldn't be out in this. Even a man built like a grizzly couldn't survive a whiteout. A man could lose his bearings 10 feet from his own front door and freeze to death walking in circles. By 3 in the afternoon, the cabin was submerged in an eerie, premature twilight. Josephine stood by the window, her forehead pressed against the freezing glass, trying to pierce the driving snow. Nothing. Only the swirling void. Then a heavy thud against the heavy oak door. Josephine leaped back. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It could be a bear seeking shelter or a desperate drifter. She crept toward the door. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by a low, agonizing groan that was barely audible over the wind. She dropped the poker and threw the iron latch, pulling with all her weight. The wind caught the door violently, ripping it outward. Snow blasted into her face, blinding her. A massive shape fell inward, crashing onto the floorboards. It was Gideon. He was covered in a thick crust of ice. He wasn't moving. Josephine fell to her knees. She grabbed the collar of his coat and hauled backward. He was impossibly heavy, dead weight against the slick floor, but adrenaline flooded her veins. She planted her boots, digging in her heels, and dragged him entirely inside. She lunged forward, grabbed the door handle, and fought the roaring wind to slam it shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt into place. The sudden quiet in the cabin was jarring. "Gideon!" She mouthed, her throat constricting. No sound came out. She scrambled back to him. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. His face was ghostly pale beneath the scars. She frantically unfastened his heavy coat, peeling the stiff, frozen leather away. That was when she saw the blood. His left thigh was soaked, the heavy canvas of his trousers torn to shreds. The blood was a dark, wet crimson pooling rapidly on the wooden floor. He had slipped, or something had caught him. It was a jagged, ugly tear deep enough to expose the pale flash of muscle beneath the fat. Josephine didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had someone else to save them. She ran to the stove, grabbing a clean basin, and poured water from the boiling kettle into it. She grabbed a clean rag from the shelf, a bottle of clear, harsh whiskey Gideon kept for medicinal use, and his sewing kit. She dropped to her knees beside him. She took his heavy hunting knife from his belt and sliced the canvas of his trousers open from the knee to the hip, exposing the full ruin of the wound. It was a ragged cut, bleeding heavily. Gideon groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy, unfocused. His massive hand weakly reached down, grabbing her wrist with startling strength. "Don't!" He slurred, his voice barely a rasp. "Leave it. Too cold." Josephine yanked her wrist free. She met his eyes. She shook her head, a sharp, violent motion. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey, uncorked it with her teeth, and spat the cork onto the floor. She didn't hesitate. She poured the raw alcohol directly into the open wound. Gideon let out a raw, guttural roar. His back arched off the floor, his hands flying up to grip the edges of the floorboards until his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. Josephine pressed her hands firmly on his chest, holding him down as the spasm passed. She waited until his breathing hitched and slowed. He looked up at her chest, heaving sweat-cutting tracks through the snow, melting on his face. She took the wet rag and aggressively cleaned the edges of the wound, wiping away the blood and grit. Then she threaded the needle with thick, black gut string. She held up the needle. She looked at him silently, demanding his permission, or at least his compliance. Gideon stared at her. Her hands weren't shaking. Her eyes were hard-focused, utterly fearless. She wasn't the broken, cowering girl from the saloon. She was steel. He let his head fall back against the floorboards. "Do it," he breathed. Josephine pinched the ragged edges of his flesh together. She pushed the needle through. Gideon flinched, a low hiss escaping his lips, but he didn't move away. She worked with brutal efficiency. Pulled tie cut, over and over. 10 stitches, 15, 20. Her fingers were slick with his blood, but the bleeding finally slowed, then stopped. She tied the final knot and snipped the gut string. She grabbed a clean roll of cotton bandage and bound his thigh, tightly securing it with a firm knot. She sat back on her heels, utterly exhausted. The front of her dress was stained red. Her hands were trembling now that the crisis had passed. Gideon rolled his head to the side, looking at the neat, tight row of bandages on his leg. Then he looked at her. The wind screamed outside, battering the cabin, trying to rip the roof off. But inside, the air was heavy with a profound, sudden intimacy. He slowly reached out. His hand calloused and thick moved toward her. Josephine flinched, a purely reflexive action, expecting a blow, but his hand didn't strike. His rough fingers gently touched the side of her face, smearing a tiny streak of his blood on her pale cheek. "You're a tough little bird." He whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion and an emotion she couldn't name. Josephine didn't pull away from his touch. She closed her eyes, taking a long, deep breath, and let the warmth of his hand anchor her to the earth. The fever spiked at midnight. It was a vicious, consuming thing that turned Gideon from a mountain of a man into a trembling, fragile creature. The infection had set in fast, deep, in the torn muscle of his leg. Josephine knew the signs. She had seen men die of lesser wounds in the damp, freezing alleys of mining camps. She refused to let it happen here. She spent an hour dragging him from the floor to the heavy timber bed. It required agonizing, punishing effort. She wedged her shoulder under his armpit, her boots slipping on the blood-slicked floorboards, pushing and hauling until he finally collapsed onto the furs. He was dead weight, his skin radiating a dry, terrifying heat. For the next 3 days, the cabin became a purgatory of boiling water, cold rags, and silence. The blizzard blew itself out, leaving behind a profound, crushing stillness. The snow was piled halfway up the frosted window pane. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the iron pot of melting snow, and the man dying in the bed. Josephine didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the mattress, dipping a torn strip of cotton into the icy water, wringing it out, and pressing it to his forehead, his neck, his chest. He thrashed in the grip of delirium. His massive hands would suddenly shoot out, grabbing the air, fighting invisible phantoms. During the second night, he began to speak. They weren't coherent sentences. They were fragmented, torn bits of a nightmare. He muttered about the ice. He pleaded with someone to run. And then came the raw, guttural cries that made Josephine's blood run cold, the sounds of a man being torn apart. He was reliving the bear attack. He would claw at his own scarred face, his fingers digging into the jagged white lines until Josephine caught his wrists. She pinned his hands to the mattress, leaning her entire body weight against his arms to keep him from tearing his own skin open. "Shh," she breathed, the only sound she had made in days. It was just a rush of air, soft and desperate. She pressed her forehead against his burning shoulder. "Stay here. Stay with me." She didn't know if he could hear her through the veil of the fever, but slowly his muscles would uncoil. His breathing would hitch, then settle into a shallow, ragged rhythm. She poured whiskey down his throat, forcing him to swallow. She boiled willow bark she found in his meticulously labeled jars and spooned the bitter tea past his cracked lips. She changed the bloody bandages, her stomach churning at the sight of the angry red flesh, cleaning away the pus with boiling water and harsh soap. She didn't let herself feel pity. Pity was useless. She worked with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a soldier holding a besieged fort. On the morning of the fourth day, the sun finally broke through the clouds. A brilliant, blinding shaft of light cut through the top half of the window, falling directly across the heavy timber bed. Josephine was slumped in the wooden chair, her chin resting on her chest, a dry rag clutched in her hand. She jerked awake, her heart hammering instantly, looking at the bed. Gideon's chest was rising and falling in deep, even measurements. The terrible, frantic panting had stopped. His skin, though pale and drawn, was no longer flushed with that unnatural bruised red. The dry heat was gone, replaced by a cool, clammy sweat. The fever had broken. Josephine stood up. Her joints popped her back, screaming in protest. She walked to the bed and pressed the back of her hand against his cheek. It was cool. Gideon's eyelids fluttered. They felt heavy, crusted with sleep and grit. He opened them slowly, squinting against the harsh glare of the sunlight. It took several long seconds for his eyes to focus. When they did, they locked onto Josephine. She looked terrible. Her face was hollowed out by exhaustion, her hair a tangled, greasy mess, her dress stained with old blood and dirt. Dark, bruised circles hung beneath her pale, sharp eyes. Gideon tried to sit up. A white-hot spike of pain shot through his left leg, stealing his breath. He fell back against the pillows with a harsh grunt. Josephine immediately pushed his chest down, a firm, non-negotiable pressure. She shook her head. She picked up a tin cup of water from the nightstand and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin into his thick beard. When he finished, he let his head loll to the side. He looked around the cabin. The fire was roaring. The floor had been scrubbed clean of the blood. The woodpile was restocked. He looked back at her. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with a profound, unspoken understanding. He was a man who owed his life to no one. He had survived the mountain by trusting only himself. Now he was entirely at the mercy of a woman the world had discarded as broken. How long? He rasped. His throat sounded like it was filled with crushed gravel. Josephine held up 4 fingers. Gideon closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. "You stayed." It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of a debt he could never repay. She could have taken his gold. She could have taken his horse and ridden down the mountain the moment the storm broke. Josephine didn't smile. She just pulled the heavy furs up to his chest, tucking them firmly around his shoulders. She picked up the empty basin and walked toward the stove. She had kept the fort. Now they just had to survive the winter. Recovery was a slow, humiliating process for a man used to moving mountains. For a month, Gideon was confined to the cabin. He carved a heavy crutch out of a straight pine bough and learned to hobble from the bed to the stove, dragging his ruined leg behind him. The dynamic between them shifted. Josephine became the hunter. Gideon taught her how to load the heavy repeating rifle. He showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to account for the wind, how to gently squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. She learned fast. She shot a stringy winter hare her first week out, dragging it back to the cabin with a quiet, fierce pride burning in her eyes. Spring approached with agonizing slowness. The deep drifts began to pack down, forming a hard, icy crust. The constant howl of the wind softened into a steady, bitter breeze. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the mule began to scream. Josephine was at the table kneading dough. Gideon sat by the fire mending a broken leather harness. The sudden frantic braying from the lean-to shattered the quiet. Gideon dropped the leather. He grabbed his crutch and hoisted himself up. His face was instantly a mask of hard, cold violence. The mountain didn't make that kind of noise unless something was wrong. Josephine wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. She didn't ask questions. She moved to the corner, picked up the rifle, and levered around into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the small room. Gideon moved to the window, leaning heavily on the pine crutch. He wiped the condensation from the glass and peered out into the blinding white. "Trouble," he murmured. Coming up the ridge were 3 men on horseback. Their horses were blowing hard chests lathered with freezing sweat, struggling through the crusty snow. The man in the lead wore a heavy buffalo coat. Even at a distance, Josephine recognized the rat-like slouch of Hiram Reed. She tightened her grip on the rifle stock until her knuckles went white. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He had come for her. He had realized Gideon was injured, or he had simply gotten greedy for the rest of the gold, and he had come to drag her back to the mud and the smoke. "Stand away from the door," Gideon ordered softly. He reached out and took his heavy six-shooter from its holster on the wall, checking the cylinder. He didn't look afraid. He looked exhausted, deeply irritated by the intrusion of ugly men into his quiet world. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. The horses stamped and snorted, breath pluming in the freezing air. "Gideon." Hiram's voice cracked through the cold nasal and loud. "We know you're in there, open up." Gideon unbolted the heavy oak door. He pulled it open and stood in the frame. He didn't step out onto the porch. He leaned on his crutch, his massive frame blocking the entrance entirely. The six-shooter hung loosely in his right hand, pointed at the floorboards. Hiram sat on a roan gelding flanked by 2 men Josephine recognized from the Mud Hen. One was Pike, a vicious half-blind miner missing half his teeth. The other was an enforcer named Cobb, a man built like a brick wall with dead, piggish eyes. "What do you want, Hiram?" Gideon asked. His voice carried across the snow, deep and flat. Hiram sneered, shifting in his saddle. He noticed the crutch. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Heard you had a run-in with the ice, Gideon. Word down in Bitter Creek is you're laid up. Maybe dying. I'm standing right here." "Barely." Cobb grunted, spitting a stream of black tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "We come for the girl," Hiram said, puffing out his chest. "And the rest of your gold. That pouch you threw on the table, it was light. I did the math. You owe me another 2 ounces for the mute." "A deal is a deal," Gideon replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his stance. "The girl is mine. Get off my ridge." Pike unholstered his revolver, resting it lazily against his saddle horn. "Now, Gideon, let's be reasonable. You're a cripple. You can't even stand up straight. We're 3 armed men. Hand over the gold and the broken girl, and we ride away." Inside the cabin, hidden by the shadows, Josephine leveled the rifle. She rested the heavy steel barrel against the doorframe, aiming directly at the center of Hiram's chest. Her finger found the trigger. Her breath slowed. She was not a broken thing. She was the woman who had fought a grizzly's claws with raw whiskey and gut string. She would kill all 3 of them before she let them take her back. Gideon didn't look back at her, but he shifted slightly, giving her a clearer line of sight. "I'll say this once," Gideon said, the gravel in his voice hardening into granite. "The next man who draws a weapon dies. The next man who speaks her name dies." Hiram laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. He looked at Cobb. "Take him." Cobb spurred his horse forward, raising his shotgun. He didn't make it 2 feet. The deafening roar of the repeating rifle shattered the afternoon. Josephine didn't shoot Hiram. She shot Cobb's horse. The heavy slug tore through the animal's shoulder. The horse screamed, buckling instantly, throwing Cobb face first into the packed icy snow with a sickening crunch. The silence that followed was absolute. Pike froze his revolver halfway raised. Hiram's horse danced, nervously panicked by the gunshot. Gideon slowly raised his six-shooter, leveling it directly at Hiram's face. He pulled the hammer back with his thumb. The click echoed off the pines. "She doesn't miss," Gideon said softly. "Now ride." Hiram didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The sight of Cobb groaning in the bloody snow, his horse thrashing its last in the drifts, stripped away any illusion of control the gambler held. Pike spurred his mount backward, his eyes wide, holstering his gun with frantic, clumsy hands. "Get him up!" Hiram spat at Pike, his voice tight with panic. It took them 5 ugly, desperate minutes to haul Cobb's massive limp frame over the back of Pike's horse. Cobb's face was a mask of dark blood and pulverized bone where he had hit the ice. They didn't look back at the cabin. They turned their exhausted animals down the ridge, disappearing into the blinding white. Gideon lowered the hammer of his revolver. The metallic click was the loudest sound left in the world. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the empty trail, letting the freezing air rush over his face. Then he turned around. He shut the heavy oak door and dropped the iron bolt into place. Josephine still stood by the window. The heavy repeating rifle was pressed hard against her shoulder, the barrel resting on the wood, a thin wisp of grey smoke curling from the muzzle. Her breathing was fast, shallow. Her eyes were locked on the space where Hiram had just been. She looked like a taut wire ready to snap and lash out at anything that moved. Gideon hobbled toward her, leaning his weight on the pine crutch. He stopped a foot away. The air in the cabin smelled of sulphur-burnt powder and baked bread. He didn't take the gun from her. He simply reached out and placed his large, calloused hand over the receiver. "They're gone," he said. The roughness in his voice was tempered by a quiet, profound respect. "You protected our home." Our home. The words hit Josephine harder than a physical blow. She slowly lowered the rifle. Her hands began to shake, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. She looked down at her hands, smeared with flour and gripping the cold steel. She had pulled the trigger. She had meant to kill. The realization didn't bring guilt. It brought a terrifying, intoxicating surge of power. She was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. Gideon took the rifle. He set it carefully on the table. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and wrapped his massive arms around her. He didn't pull her tight. He simply offered his chest as a wall against the storm. Josephine went rigid for a fraction of a second. The instinct to flee, to curl into a defensive ball, screamed in her mind. But the smell of him, pine resin, cold wind, and honest sweat anchored her. She let out a long, shuddering breath and rested her forehead against his chest. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of water, but she let herself be held. The winter broke 3 weeks later. It didn't happen all at once. It started with the sound of dripping water. The heavy icicles hanging from the eaves began to weep, pattering against the packed snow. The wind lost its razor edge, turning into a heavy, damp breeze that smelled of wet earth and decaying pine needles. The mountain shed its white armor, revealing a landscape of slick gray rock, dark mud, and the vibrant, violent green of new growth. Gideon's leg healed into a stiff, permanent limp. The torn muscle had fused back together, leaving a thick, ropey scar that tightened when the weather turned damp. He abandoned the crutch, walking with a heavy, rolling gait that made him look even more like a wounded bear. But his strength returned. He began running his trap lines again, clearing out the winter catch, skinning and curing the thick pelts of fox, mink, and beaver. Josephine changed too. The hollow, starved look left her face. Her cheeks filled out, flushed with the sun and the biting morning air. The grey wool dress was long gone, replaced by heavy canvas trousers she had altered from Gideon's spares, and a flannel shirt rolled up to her elbows. She chopped wood. She hauled water. She learned to read the tracks in the mud, pointing out the deep impressions of a mountain lion to Gideon, with a sharp nod of her chin. They moved around each other with the practiced grace of a seasoned team. There was no need for words. A tilt of the head meant the coffee was hot. A hand on the shoulder meant the snares were empty. A long look across the fire meant the night was settling in. One evening in late May, the air was warm enough to leave the cabin door open. The sun was dipping below the peaks, bleeding fire across the sky. Gideon was sitting on the porch step, a whetstone scraping rhythmically across his skinning knife. Josephine sat in the chair just inside the door, mending a tear in a canvas sack. Gideon stopped sharpening. He wiped the blade on his trousers and looked out at the darkening tree line. "The pelts are cured," he said. His voice was casual, but the tension underneath it was thick. "We have 70 pounds of prime winter fur, and we're entirely out of salt, coffee, and lead." Josephine stopped sewing. The needle hovered over the canvas. "I need to go down to Bitter Creek tomorrow," he said. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The jagged white scars on his face caught the dying light. "You can stay here. I'll leave you the rifle. I'll be back in 4 days." He was giving her a choice. He was offering to shield her from the town, from the filth, from the memories of the saloon. Josephine set the canvas aside. She stood up, walked to the doorway, and looked down at him. She shook her head. One sharp, decisive movement. She wasn't hiding anymore. She belonged to the mountain now, and the mountain didn't hide. She reached out and tapped the heavy hunting knife in his hand, then pointed to herself. "I go where you go." Gideon looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the hard, determined lines of her jaw. A slow, deeply hidden smile touched the corners of his mouth. He sheathed the knife. "Pack your saddlebags," he said. "We ride at dawn." The ride down the mountain was vastly different from the agonizing climb 6 months prior. The trail was treacherous, with spring run off a muddy sluice of loose rocks and rushing water, but the gelding and the mule navigated it with practiced ease. More importantly, the woman on the mule was not the same broken captive who had ridden up in a freezing haze. Josephine rode beside Gideon where the trail allowed not behind him. She sat tall in the saddle, the heavy repeating rifle snug in a custom leather scabbard Gideon had riveted to her saddle. She wore a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low over her eyes against the glare of the sun. She looked like a drifter, a hardened frontier woman who knew exactly how to use the steel she carried. By mid-afternoon, the smell of Bitter Creek reached them. It was a sour chemical stench of mining runoff, unwashed bodies, and stale beer. They rode into the main street. The mud was baking into a hard, cracked grey crust under the summer sun. The town was crawling with miners' claim jumpers and prospectors chasing the thaw. As Gideon's massive roan gelding stepped onto the main thoroughfare, the noise of the street began to die. Men stopped in their tracks. Conversations trailed off into stunned whispers. The scarred man. He wasn't dead. The rumors had sworn Hiram left him bleeding out in the snow, that the blizzard had taken him. Yet here he was, massive and terrifying. His ruined face locked in a permanent, indifferent scowl. And then they looked at the woman riding beside him. It took them a moment to recognize the mute girl. She wasn't a ragged, starving thing dragging her feet at the end of a rope. She was healthy-armed and staring back at them with a gaze so cold it made several men look away. Gideon didn't stop at the general store. He steered his horse directly toward the Mud Hen Saloon. He dismounted, tying the roan to the hitching post. Josephine slid off the mule, tying it securely next to the gelding. She adjusted the heavy canvas trousers and stepped up onto the wooden boardwalk, her boots, making a sharp, authoritative sound. Gideon walked beside her, his stiff limp making his footsteps heavy and uneven. He pushed the batwing doors open. The mud hen was packed. The air was a suffocating cloud of blue cigar smoke and cheap perfume. But the moment the doors swung open, the piano player slammed his hands down on the keys, creating a harsh, discordant chord that hung in the sudden silence. 50 heads turned toward the entrance. Miller, the thick-necked bartender, dropped a dirty rag on the bar. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, reaching instinctively for the shotgun under the counter. Gideon ignored him. His eyes scanned the room, cutting through the smoke. In the far corner, surrounded by a group of loud, unwashed prospectors, sat Hiram Reed. Hiram was mid-laugh, a shot glass halfway to his mouth. The laugh died in his throat. The blood drained from his rat-like face, leaving him the color of old ash. He slowly lowered the glass, his hands trembling so violently the amber liquid spilled over his knuckles. Gideon walked toward him. The crowd parted. Men shoved each other out of the way, desperate to avoid the mountain man's path. Josephine followed 2 steps behind him, her right hand resting casually near the heavy hunting knife she now wore on her belt. Gideon reached Hiram's table. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't yell. He simply unslung the heavy canvas sack from his shoulder and let it drop onto the center of the table. The sheer weight of it cracked the cheap wood, spilling a dozen prime, perfectly cured winter pelts across the surface. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and 50 rounds of .44 caliber. Gideon said to the room at large, though his eyes never left Hiram. Hiram swallowed hard. He looked at the pelts, then up at Gideon's scarred face, and finally his eyes flicked to Josephine. He tried to summon his old arrogance, the sneer of a man who owned people. He puffed out his chest, looking around at the miners trying to find backup. "You got nerve coming back here?" Hiram stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "You stole my property. You shot my man's horse. You trespassed on my ridge." Gideon rumbled. "You're lucky I only shot the horse." "She belongs to me." Hiram shouted his fear, violently twisting into anger. He pointed a trembling finger at Josephine. He looked at the crowd. "She's a mute, a broken-brained idiot. I raised her. I have the papers. She's my blood." The saloon was dead silent. The miners watched a pack of wild dogs waiting to see which wolf would bleed first. Hiram took a step away from the table, emboldened by the silence of the crowd. He sneered at Gideon. "You think dressing her up in men's clothes changes what she is? She's an animal, a dumb, silent animal. I'll bring the marshal down on you. I'll have you hung for theft, and I'll sell her to a crib down in Denver where she belongs." Gideon's hand moved toward his 6-shooter. The movement was slow, deliberate, a promise of impending violence. He was going to kill Hiram. He was going to put a bullet between the man's eyes and accept whatever consequences the town handed him. But before Gideon's fingers could graze the heavy iron grip, a sound cut through the stale, smoky air of the saloon. It was a voice. It was raspy from years of disuse, harsh like dried leaves, scraping across stone, but it was perfectly clear, perfectly steady, and it carried to every dark corner of the mud hen. "You don't own me, Hiram." The entire saloon froze. No one breathed. No one blinked. Every eye in the room snapped to the woman standing behind the scarred mountain man. Josephine stepped out from behind Gideon's broad back. She didn't look at the floor. She looked dead into Hiram's terrified eyes. "And I am not an animal," she said, her voice finding its cadence, growing stronger with every syllable. Hiram stared. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish on a muddy riverbank. A miner near the brass rail dropped his shot glass. It hit the spit-stained floorboards, the cheap glass shattering with a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the suffocating silence. The piano player's hands hovered over the ivory keys, paralyzed. The thick blue cigar smoke seemed to hang suspended in the stifling air. Gideon slowly turned his head. He looked down at Josephine. The scarred, immovable mountain of a man looked as if the earth had just cracked open beneath his heavy boots. His hand fell away from the iron grip of his revolver. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his dark eyes burning with a sudden fierce and possessive pride. Josephine took another step forward, putting herself entirely between Gideon and the room. She cleared her throat. It hurt. 10 years of absolute silence had built a wall of rust and dust in her chest, but she pushed through the physical ache. "You sold me for $50, she said, her voice carrying up into the soot-stained rafters. It wasn't a yell. It was cold, precise, and heavy as a lead slug. "You tied me like a dog because you were too much of a coward to earn a living with your own 2 hands. You told them I was broken, but I wasn't broken. I was waiting." Hiram backed up. He hit the edge of a poker table, his hand scrambling blindly behind him to grip the wood. "You didn't speak. Not since the cholera took your ma. You couldn't speak." "I chose not to speak." Josephine corrected him, her tone merciless. "I heard every ugly word you said to me, every threat, every curse. I locked them away because giving you my voice would have been giving you my soul. And there was nothing in this miserable town worth saying, and no one worth saying it to." She shifted her flinty gaze to the miners crowding the bar. The same men who had laughed at her, who had bid on her like a piece of slaughtered meat 6 months ago. They refused to meet her eyes. A man with a broken nose removed his bowler hat, holding it against his chest as if a funeral procession was passing. The raw, undeniable power of her dignity stripped them bare, exposing their own ugliness. She looked back at Hiram. The gambler was trembling so hard the table rattled against the floorboards. "If you ever come up that mountain again," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "If you ever say my name again, I won't shoot your horse. I will shoot you, and I will leave you for the wolves." Hiram broke. The little manufactured courage he had leaked out onto the dirty floor. He raised his hands, palms out, shrinking in on himself. He didn't say a word. He just nodded a frantic, pathetic twitch of his head and scrambled sideways along the wall. He bumped into a chair, stumbling like a blind rat, before shoving through the back door into the alley. The hinges whined in his wake, the only testament that he had been there at all. Josephine watched the empty doorway. She didn't feel a triumphant rush. She just felt clean, like a heavy, rotting layer of skin had finally been peeled away, leaving fresh, breathing flesh beneath. She turned to Miller, the thick-necked bartender. He was still holding the dirty rag, staring at her in slack-jawed shock. He asked for flour salt coffee and 50 rounds of 44, Josephine said. Her voice was settling now, finding a smooth, authoritative timbre that commanded the room. "Take it out of the pelts. Keep the change." Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, ma'am." They rode out of Bitter Creek an hour later. The supplies were packed tight and balanced on the mule. The town watched them go from the wooden boardwalks, but nobody said a word. Nobody followed. The climb back up the ridge was a slow, rhythmic ascent. The geldings' hooves struck stone, a steady drumbeat marking their departure from the filth. The air cooled, shedding the oppressive heat of the valley. The chaotic chemical stink of the mining camp faded, replaced by the sharp, holy scent of alpine spruce, wet earth, and ancient granite. Josephine breathed it in deeply. Her throat throbbed a dull, raw ache, but it was a good pain. It was the pain of muscles being used for the first time in a decade. She watched Gideon's broad back swaying with the roan's gait. He hadn't turned around. He hadn't demanded an explanation or peppered her with eager questions. He gave her the space to let the echo of her own voice settle into her bones. When they finally reached the plateau, the sun had dipped below the peaks, casting the world in deep purple twilight. The cabin sat exactly as they had left it, a sturdy fortress against the vast, darkening sky. They dismounted. They unloaded the canvas sacks in tandem, moving with the same unspoken, flawless rhythm they had perfected over the brutal winter. Gideon carried the last heavy sack of flour inside, setting it down by the pantry. Josephine stood by the cast-iron stove, striking a match to light the oil lantern. The yellow flame flared, casting warm, dancing light across the rough-hewn logs. Gideon took off his heavy elk-hide coat. He hung it on the wooden peg. He turned and looked at her. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the heavy, guarded quiet of two strangers surviving a storm. It was the comfortable, settling quiet of a finished day. "You were waiting," Gideon repeated softly, his deep, gravelly voice filling the small room, recalling the words she had thrown at Hiram. Josephine placed the glass chimney over the lantern flame. She turned to face him. She walked across the floorboards, stopping mere inches from his massive chest. She reached up her calloused fingers, gently tracing the jagged, pale scars on his cheek. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. "I was waiting for a reason," she said, looking up into his dark, tired eyes. A soft, genuine smile finally broke across her face, changing her entirely, softening the hard edges the world had forced upon her. "I found it." Gideon let out a long, heavy breath. He wrapped his thick arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his ruined face in her hair, breathing in the scent of the cold wind and the woman who had saved his life. The mountain was a harsh, unforgiving place. It broke weak men and buried the careless. But for the scarred trapper and his no longer silent bride, it was the only piece of the world that mattered. It was finally home. The wild frontier forces people to reveal who they truly are. Hiram was a coward, the town was a pack of wolves, but Gideon and Josephine proved that true strength lies in protecting the ones you love. Josephine didn't just find her voice. She found a home where she was finally heard, and Gideon found a love that looked past his scars. Did you love this intense, slow-burn Western romance? What was your favorite moment from Josephine's triumph in the saloon? Drop a comment below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to our channel for more epic audio dramas.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, the scarred mountain man bought the mute bride. Her first words made the saloon freeze. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the story highlights the power of looking beyond what's visible on the surface. Whether it's scars, silence, or someone's past, we never really know a person's full story until we take the time to understand them. That quiet reminder of compassion and respect is something we can all carry into our daily lives. Which moment stayed with you the longest, and what do you think it revealed about the characters? Have you ever been surprised by someone after learning more about them, instead of relying on a first impression? Maybe this week is a good chance to listen a little more closely and show kindness before making assumptions. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to like or subscribe if you'd enjoy more stories like this.